They say the mist in the Scottish Highlands hides the truth, but I never realized it could also bury a man alive while his heart was still beating. My name is Alastair, and for 7 years, I believed I had built an impenetrable fortress of a life in the coastal village of Stores. Reach. My wife, Mary, was the daughter of a local laird, and our home, a converted stone croft overlooking the gray, churning Atlantic, was supposed to be our sanctuary. But every sanctuary has a serpent, and ours was Mary's younger sister, Ailey. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper intentions, always lingering in the periphery of our marriage like a persistent chill. It began with subtle transgressions during the annual Highland gatherings. While the pipes wailed and the village danced, Ailey would find reasons to be near me, her touch lingering a second too long on my arm, her whispers disguised by the roar of the wind. She called me the prize, a joke she claimed was aimed at Mary's luck. But the way her eyes tracked my every movement suggested a darker obsession. I chose silence, thinking it the noble path. I didn't want to tarnish Mary's bond with the only blood relative she had left after their mother's passing. I convinced myself that Ailey was merely a restless soul, perhaps envious of our stability. But I was blind to the web she was weaving. The first true fracture occurred during a storm-drenched night at the laird's estate. Mary had gone to the cellars to fetch more peat for the fire, leaving me alone in the library. Ailey appeared from the shadows, the scent of damp heather and something metallic clinging to her. She didn't just flirt. She laid claim. She blocked the heavy oak door, leaning against it with a terrifyingly calm smile, telling me that the mist outside was nothing compared to the secrets she could keep from me. When I rebuked her, calling her behavior a disgrace to her clan, she didn't flinch. She simply laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and whispered that if she couldn't have the heart of the home, she would burn the house down with me inside it. I still said nothing to Mary, a mistake that would soon cost me my reputation, my career at the local distillery, and very nearly my sanity. The betrayal arrived not with a scream, but with a digital execution. An email, meticulously crafted and sent to the distillery's board, the local kirk, and every prominent family in the glen, painted me as a predator. Ailey had produced 3 pages of hauntingly detailed lies, claiming I had been using the isolation of the Highlands to corner and harass her for years. The evidence was the killing blow. Photos that appeared to show us in compromising positions in the ruins of the old chapel. To a casual observer, the lighting and the silhouettes were damning. In reality, they were sophisticated fakes, staged with a look-alike or stitched together from moments I hadn't even realized she was documenting. When I returned to our croft, the air was colder inside than out. Mary sat by the hearth, the glow of the embers reflecting in eyes that no longer held any warmth for me. As I poured out the truth, the library incident, the lingering touches, the threats, her face remained a mask of stone. She told me that silence was the language of the guilty. She suggested that perhaps I had enjoyed the thrill of her sister's pursuit and only spoke up now because the consequences had finally come to collect. She refused to stand by me, stating that her loyalty lay with the blood of her sister unless I could prove the impossible. I was cast out of my own life, suspended from my position as master, distiller, and treated as a pariah in the village streets. I became a ghost in my own home. Driven by a desperate need for survival, I began my own investigation. I realized Ailey wasn't just a scorned woman. She was a tactician. I started spending my nights in the attic, digging through old family crates that Mary had refused to touch. That's where I found the first piece of the puzzle, a hidden ledger belonging to their late mother. It wasn't just a book of accounts. It was a record of Ailey's disturbances since childhood. There were mentions of another man, a stable hand from years ago, who had vanished after Ailey accused him of similar crimes. The patterns were identical. It wasn't love or even lust that drove her. It was a pathological need to dismantle anything Mary cherished. The turning point came from the most unlikely of allies, Fiona, a cousin who had always been the black sheep of the family. She reached out to me in the dead of night. meeting me by the standing stones near the cliff's edge. She revealed that Ailey's obsession wasn't just a whim. She had been systematically stealing Mary's life for years. Fiona had seen Ailey wearing Mary's old clothes in secret and had even overheard her practicing Mary's signature. But the most chilling revelation was that Ailey had been scouting me long before I even met my wife. She had seen me first, but I had chosen Mary. And in her twisted mind, that was a debt that could only be paid in ruin. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted Mary. I showed her the ledger and told her about the stable hand. The cracks in her resolve finally began to show when she realized that Ailey had been keeping trophies, old journals, and photographs of us that had gone missing over the months. Together, we did what I should have done years ago. We stopped playing her game of shadows. We installed discreet cameras, not just for security, but to catch the phantom that was haunting our perimeter. It didn't take long. Ailey, emboldened by her perceived victory, began to escalate. She was no longer satisfied with destroying my name. She wanted to witness the collapse. One night, the motion sensors alerted my phone at 3 a.m. The footage was harrowing. Ailey was standing in our garden, draped in a shawl that belonged to Mary, staring into our bedroom window with an expression of pure, vacant longing. She wasn't just a liar. She was losing her grip on reality. When the police finally arrived, they found more than just a stalker. They found a woman who had built a shrine to a life that wasn't hers in a rented room in the next village. There were cutout photos of my face and detailed notes on my daily routine. The restraining order was issued, and the village's whispers turned from condemnation of me to pity for the fallen daughter of the laird. But as the mist settles over the glen, I know the scars on my marriage will take a lifetime to heal, and I still look to the shadows, wondering if the serpent is truly gone. The restraining order was a paper shield against a storm of iron, while the village of Stores Reach settled into a fragile silence. My mind was a hive of buzzing suspicions. The ledger I had found in the attic, the one belonging to Mary's mother, had a series of dates meticulously scratched out with a heavy nib. I spent my nights in the shadows of the distillery's warehouse, away from Mary's watchful, cold eyes, using ultraviolet light to reveal the ghost of the ink underneath. What I found chilled me more than the Atlantic spray. The stable hand, Lachlan, hadn't just vanished after Ailey's accusations. The ledger recorded a substantial payment made by the laird, Mary's father, to a local solicitor on the very day Lachlan was last seen. It wasn't hush money for a victim. It was a fee for a disappearance. I began to realize that the drama with Ailey wasn't a localized infection. It was a hereditary curse. I tracked down the retired solicitor, a man named Callum who lived in a decaying cottage near the Black Isle. He was a man who drank his secrets with his peat-heavy whiskey. Over a bottle of our finest single malt, his tongue loosened. He spoke of the madness of the lineage and how the laird had spent a fortune keeping his daughters' reputations pristine. But then he dropped the anchor that dragged me under. It wasn't Ailey who accused the boy first, Alastair. It was Mary. My heart stopped. The story I had been told, that Ailey was the sole predator, was a carefully constructed lie. Mary had been the architect of Lachlan's ruin, and Ailey had merely been the witness who learned how to play the game from her older sister. The betrayal cut deeper than any of Ailey's sharp whispers. I returned to our stone croft, looking at Mary as she sat by the window, knitting with a precision that now felt clinical. I realized that my wife wasn't the victim of a jealous sister. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. Mary had used Ailey's known instability as a convenient scapegoat for years. Every time Mary felt her control over me or the estate slipping, Ailey would act out, and Mary would play the martyr. drawing me closer in her feigned grief. The fake photos sent to the distillery. Ailey might have sent them, but as I looked at the angles and the timing, I realized only Mary could have provided the access to my private office to plant the evidence. My investigation turned inward, toward the very walls of the home I had helped restore. If Mary and Ailey were partners in this psychological theater, there had to be a script. I waited until Mary left for the Sunday service at the kirk, her black veil fluttering like a crow's wing. I didn't go to the attic this time. I went to the cellar, to the foundation stones that predated the Highland clearances. Behind a rack of aging wine, I found a loose stone, marked with a faint Celtic knot, the same symbol I had seen on the laird's signet ring. Behind it lay a hollow space containing a leather-bound journal and a set of keys I didn't recognize. The journal was Mary's. It wasn't a diary of love. It was a manual of manipulation. She had documented my progress since the day we met at the University of Edinburgh. She had chosen me because I was an orphan, a man with no roots to pull him away from her ancestral lands. She had orchestrated Ailey's crush on me to test my loyalty, pushing her sister into my path like a wolf toward a lamb. The most harrowing entry was dated 3 years ago. Alastair is becoming too independent at the distillery. He speaks of moving to Glasgow. It is time for Ailey to become difficult again. He must feel he is the only one who can protect me from her. My entire marriage had been a series of controlled crises designed to keep me tethered to this lonely cliffside. But the keys held a darker purpose. One of them matched the lock of an old, rusted gate at the edge of the laird's estate, a path that led to the screaming cliffs. I drove there in the pouring rain, the wind howling through the glens like the ghosts of the broken. At the end of the path was a small, stone hunting lodge, long forgotten by the village. I entered, the air thick with the smell of rot and old wool. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, a series of photographs, not fake ones, but candid shots of me, Mary, and Ailey. But there was a fourth person in the photos, their face scratched out with a knife. It was Lachlan. He hadn't left the Highlands. The keys opened a heavy iron door in the floor of the lodge. As I descended into the darkness, I realized that the disappearance of the stable hand was far more literal than I had ever dared to imagine. The iron door groaned, a sound like a dying beast echoing in the cramped stone shaft as I forced it open. I descended the rusted ladder, my torch cutting through the thick, stagnant air of the hunting lodge's subcellar. What I found was not a dungeon, but a meticulously organized archive of ruin. There were crates filled with personal items, watches, rings, letters, belonging to men who had once been prominent in the glen. Lachlan's silver flask was there, tarnished and dented, resting atop a stack of journals. As I leafed through them, the magnitude of the sisters' deception became clear. This wasn't just a family with a difficult daughter. It was a predatory dynasty. Mary was the lure, the perfect, stoic wife who offered a man roots and respectability. Ailey was the catalyst, the insane sister who created the chaos that forced the husband to surrender his autonomy, his finances, and eventually his soul to the estate. The journals revealed a pattern that spanned decades. Before me, there had been a surveyor from Inverness, and before him, a young architect from Edinburgh. Each had been systematically dismantled by the same family drama. Ailey would play the stalker, the harasser, or the victim, depending on what the situation required to isolate the husband from his peers. And Mary, the loyal wife, would handle the legal and financial fallout, slowly siphoning their assets into the laird's dwindling coffers. I found my own name in the latest ledger, with a date circled in red, the date Ailey sent the photos to the distillery. Underneath, in Mary's elegant, cold script, were the words. Phase 3 complete. The distillery shares are within reach. Alastair's isolation is total. The air in the cellar felt like it was thickening, pressing against my lungs. I realized then that I wasn't just a husband who had been betrayed. I was a harvest. The screaming cliffs weren't named for the wind. They were named for the men who had realized too late that they had married a spider in her shadow. I gathered the most damning documents, including a signed confession from the solicitor, Callum that he had hidden in a separate envelope, perhaps as insurance against the sisters. As I prepared to climb back up, I heard the faint, rhythmic sound of a car engine approaching the lodge. The headlights swept across the high windows of the upper floor. They were here. They hadn't gone to the Kirk. They had been waiting for me to find the truth, to see if I was strong enough to be broken. The storm reached its crescendo as I emerged from the cellar, the truth burning like acid in my pocket. I found them together in the drawing room of the lodge, not fighting, not screaming, but sitting in silence by a dying fire, sharing a bottle of the distillery's rarest malt. The mask of the grieving wife and the obsessed sister had slipped away entirely, leaving only two cold, calculating women who looked at me not as a person, but as a failing asset. Mary didn't offer an apology or a tear. Her silence was a confession of absolute power. She merely watched me with those gray, Atlantic eyes, waiting for my move. In that moment, the terrifying symmetry of their partnership became clear. Ailey was the fire that destroyed, and Mary was the ash that settled, claiming everything left behind. Mary's expression shifted only slightly when I threw the ledger onto the table between them. She didn't deny the contents. Instead, she spoke through her actions, pouring a third glass of whiskey and pushing it toward me. Her gaze told me everything, that the moral turpitude clause in our marriage contract was already being executed by her lawyers, that my shares in the distillery were already being transferred, and that any attempt to go to the police would be met with the full weight of the laird's remaining influence. Ailey, meanwhile, sat in the corner, her madness replaced by a chillingly lucid smirk. She wasn't the victim of a mental breakdown. She was the enforcer of the family legacy, a woman who found joy in the surgical precision of a man's ruin. The final betrayal, however, was yet to be revealed. As I backed toward the door, Mary stood up, her movements graceful and predatory. She didn't try to stop me. Instead, she pointed toward the window overlooking the cliffs. She had already called the local constable, the same man who owed his position to her father, and reported me for breaking and entering the lodge and assaulting her sister. I realized that my investigation was the final piece of their trap. By finding the truth, I had provided them with the narrative of a deranged, paranoid husband who had finally snapped. The sirens began to wail in the distance, mixing with the howl of the gale. I had the evidence in my hands, but in this glen, the truth was whatever the sisters decided it to be. I had to choose, stay and fight a rigged game, or disappear into the mist like Lachlan before me. The blue and red lights began to dance against the rough-hewn stone walls, a rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of my own execution. Mary remained seated, her hand steady as she sipped the golden liquid, while Ailey stood by the mantel, her shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain. I understood then that their greatest weapon wasn't the lies they told, but the silence they commanded. They had spent years perfecting this ritual of ruin, turning the isolated beauty of the Highlands into a prison for those they deemed useful. The screaming cliffs were not a metaphor. They were a boundary line, between the world of the living and the world of the forgotten. I looked at the documents in my hand, the ink blurring as my hands shook with a cocktail of rage and terror. I realized that if I walked out that door, I would be walking into a narrative they had already written. The constable would find the deranged husband, the bruised sister, and the weeping wife. In the eyes of the law, I was already a ghost. But Mary had made one fatal calculation. She assumed I was like the men before me, men who valued their reputations more than their freedom. She thought I would succumb to the shame she had so carefully cultivated. I backed away, not toward the front door where the law waited, but toward the back of the lodge, toward the precipice that dropped sharply into the Atlantic. I remembered the stories the old-timers at the distillery told about the smugglers. Paths, hidden veins in the rock that only those who truly knew the land could find. As the heavy boots of the constable hit the front porch, I didn't beg for mercy. I saw a flicker of something new in Mary's eyes, not fear, but a cold curiosity. She didn't think I had the courage to jump. She didn't realize that I would rather be claimed by the sea than by her shadow. I threw the ledger into the fireplace, not to destroy the evidence, but to create a distraction of rising smoke and heat. As the room filled with the acrid scent of burning paper, I stepped out into the freezing maw of the Highland night, disappearing into the mist just as the door was kicked open. The descent was a nightmare of slick slate and freezing spray. My fingers bled as I clawed at the tufts of heather, my body screaming against the sheer verticality of the cliff. But I found it, the narrow, moss-covered ledge that the old smugglers used to bypass the laird's taxes. I hid in a sea cave as the searchlights from the villages, volunteer rescue team swept the water above. I realized then that my survival depended on my death. If they thought I had perished in the Atlantic, they would grow complacent. They would stop looking for the evidence I had managed to stuff into my waterproof flask before fleeing. As I shivered in the dark, listening to the roar of the tide, I began to plan my own resurrection. I would not just return to clear my name. I didn't die that night, though the Atlantic tried its best to crush the life out of me against the jagged teeth of the shore. I survived because the rage in my marrow was hotter than the icy spray. For weeks, I lived as a phantom in the high glens, moving between abandoned shieling huts and the deep pine forests. I was a man without a name, a man who had been erased by the very people he had sworn to protect. But as I watched from the ridges through a pair of stolen binoculars, I saw the cracks in the sisters' foundation finally begin to widen. Without a common enemy to focus on, the poison they had brewed for me began to turn inward. I saw Ailey wandering the village alone, her eyes wilder than before. And I saw Mary struggling to maintain the facade of the grieving, abandoned wife as the distillery's debts finally began to surface. The betrayal I had expected finally arrived, but not from an outside force. It was Ailey who broke first. From my vantage point near the old distillery ruins, I watched her confront Mary on the balcony of their estate. Even without hearing their words, the body language was unmistakable. Ailey was no longer the willing accomplice. She was a woman who had been promised a prize she would never receive. Mary had used her sister's obsession as a tool, and now that the tool was no longer useful, she was trying to discard her. I saw Mary hand Ailey a small, familiar-looking bottle, the same sedative they had used on the men who vanished. It was a chilling revelation. Mary wasn't just the architect. She was the ultimate predator, willing to consume even her own blood to maintain her grip on the Highland soil. I knew then that I couldn't wait any longer. My investigation had led me to the final piece of the puzzle, a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands that the laird had used to hide the distillery's true profits for decades. It wasn't just a family drama. It was a massive international financial fraud. The missing men weren't just victims of a sister's jealousy. They were auditors, surveyors, and rivals who had come too close to the truth. Armed with this knowledge and the confession I had retrieved from the solicitor Callum, I prepared for the final reckoning. I didn't go to the local police. They were in Mary's pocket. Instead, I sent a coded message to the Highland Revenue Service and a journalist in Edinburgh who had been trying to crack the Laird's secrets for years. The stage was set for the final act, and I would be the one to pull the curtain. A dead man's word is a powerful thing, but his presence is a weapon that cuts through the thickest lies. I chose the night of the winter solstice to return, a night when the wind across the Minch howls with the voices of 1,000 years. I didn't come with a torch or a shout. I came with the cold, calculated precision of the fiscal trap I had set. The journalist, Mr. Sinclair, and the investigators from the Revenue Service were already positioned in the village, their silent presence a gathering storm that Mary, in her arrogance, had failed to detect. She believed I was a feast for the crabs at the bottom of the Atlantic, and that confidence was her undoing. I watched from the shadows of the old distillery gates as the first of the black cars pulled up to the estate. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom, but in the great hall of the laird's house, beneath the moth-eaten banners of a clan that had long since lost its honor. I entered through the servants' passage, a ghost in tattered wool and salt-stained boots. Mary was at her desk, the ledger of my ruin open before her, while Ailey lay on the sofa, her breathing shallow and ragged. The sedative Mary had given her had been intended to be permanent. When Mary looked up and saw me, the mask finally shattered. For the first time, I didn't see the predator. I saw a woman who realized she had been outplayed by the very man she thought she had harvested. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the waterproof flask on her desk, the one containing the evidence of the Cayman accounts and the signed confession of the solicitor. The arrival of the authorities was the final nail in the coffin. They didn't just find a financial fraud. They found the archive of discarded lives in the lodge. And they found Ailey, who, in her drug-induced delirium, began to whisper names. Names of men who had gone south or immigrated. Years ago, the ground beneath the estate was a graveyard of secrets. And as the forensic teams began their work, the true horror of the sisters' legacy was laid bare. Mary didn't scream or plead. She simply stood, adjusted her shawl, and walked toward the waiting car with the same cold dignity she had used to dismantle my life. Ailey was taken to a secure facility in Inverness, her mind finally fractured beyond repair by the betrayal of the sister she had once worshipped. The aftermath of the scandal left the village of Stores Reach in a state of stunned silence. The laird's house was seized by the crown, and the distillery, the pride of the glen, was sold to a consortium from the south to pay the massive back taxes and reparations. I was cleared of all charges, my reputation restored by the very headlines that condemned the sisters. But the victory felt like salt in an open wound. I was no longer Alastair, the master distiller. I was the man who had survived the spider's web, a curiosity for the tourists and a ghost to the locals. Every time I looked at the gray horizon, I didn't see beauty. I saw the cold, uncaring witness to a decade of calculated cruelty. I left the Highlands on a Tuesday morning, the mist clinging to the glens as if trying to pull me back. I didn't take much, only my tools, a few books, and the silver flask that had saved my life. As I drove past the screaming cliffs, one last time, I pulled the car over. The wind was quiet for once, the Atlantic a calm sheet of lead. I realized then that the tragedy wasn't just what they had done to me, but what they had done to the land. They had turned a place of sanctuary into a place of predation, staining the heather with the greed of a dying lineage. I threw the keys to the stone croft into the abyss, watching them vanish into the foam, a final payment to the ghosts of the men who hadn't been as lucky as I was. Today, I live in a small coastal town in Cornwall, a place where the sun feels a little warmer and the past feels a little further away. I don't look over my shoulder as often as I used to, but I still can't stand the smell of peat smoke or the sound of a woman's sharp, melodic laugh. The story of Alastair and the Sisters of Storrs Reach has become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the pubs of the High Glens about the danger of marrying into a dynasty built on shadows. My marriage was a lie, my love was a tool, and my life was a harvest. But I am the one who remains. And in the silence of the night, when the wind catches the corner of the house, I know that the greatest revenge wasn't the trial or the prison. It was the simple, defiant act of continuing to breathe.